In this lesson, we're going to talk about naming conventions for the kinds of things that you get to name as a software developer. So things like public classes, methods and properties, private fields, locally scoped variables, and so on. And so when we talk about naming conventions, we're talking about standards that are established by the community at large, and then more specifically by the developers within the organization that you work for. And those naming conventions will, first of all, help everybody write code that kind of looks similar, so that when somebody new comes and looks at your code to support it or to add features to it, they're not completely confused about what they see. The names that you've chosen convey meaning, and the way that they're structured, their casing, will give the viewer some hints as to the usage of that particular identifier. And so most naming conventions really focus on either capitalization schemes, like we'll talk about in a moment, or have to do with the types of words that you choose for the given identifier. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's talk about capitalization schemes. There are two primary capitalization schemes that are used. There's Pascal casing, as you can see an example here. The first letter of every word in the identifier is a capital letter, and that's in contrast to camel casing, where the first letter of the first word is in lowercase, but then every subsequent word is capitalized. The first letter of that word is capitalized. So Pascal casing and camel casing. And at a high level, just to kind of say, in general, everything public will be Pascal cased, everything private will be camel cased. So things with local scope or that are private in nature will typically be camel cased. Things that are public in nature, class names, method names, public methods, public properties, those will be Pascal cased. So let's take a look at this CS-ASP_044. This application does absolutely nothing. It's just a bunch of random code that I wrote loosely based on things that we've already looked at previously, but it doesn't work at all. Okay, I'm just wanting to point out some examples of each of the situations where you would use either Pascal case or camel case. So let's start off at the very top with class names. Class names should be Pascal case, as you can see, capital H in hero, capital M in monster, capital B in battle, and even in the default.aspx.cs class, you can see the capital D in default. All right, so that's just a standard naming convention that even Microsoft follows and all developers try to follow. Then moving on from there, if we take a look at public method names, let's see, where is a public method? Here we go. In battle, I have this public void determine battle. It's Pascal cased because it's public. Capital D in determine, capital B in battle. All right. And then moving back to talk about public properties, like this public string name and this public int hit points, you can see that those are Pascal cased as well. Capital N in name, capital H, capital P in hit points. All right. All right, so moving on from the Pascal case, let's talk about things that are camel cased. So for example, going into the default.aspx.cs, you can see that we have this locally scoped variable called damage inflicted on monster. And so there's a lowercase d, capital I in inflicted, O, and capital M on monster. So why do we use the lowercase d? Because we're trying to use camel casing for locally scoped variables. All right, the same is true for any private fields. Now you'll recall that we talked about public properties and private fields, and that public properties are kind of the gatekeepers that ensure that private fields can't be set to an illogical value. The private fields actually hold the state of a given instance of an object, but the properties, at least used in this full format, as we see here, not the auto-implemented properties that we used to begin with, but these fully formed property definitions that they are they're actually using a little bit different convention, as you can see. I forgot to mention this. Private fields are typically prefixed by an underscore, and I'll point out why that is in just 1 second. So you can see that we have underscore, underscore name, underscore hit points, used in the get and the set, and then in the constructor they're used as well to set the initial state of the new instance of the hero class to a valid value. Okay, so why do they use underscores? Well, it has to do with input parameters to methods. So you can see in this case, in this constructor, there's a lowercase n in name and a lowercase h, uppercase p in hit points. So we're using camel casing here for input parameters, because whenever I want to use a new instance of our class or call any kind of method, for example, here we'll go hero2 equals new hero. We want IntelliSense to look like every other method inside the .NET Framework class library. You don't see the input parameters to methods in the .NET Framework class library using underscores. And so what that kind of pushes us towards is using camel casing for input parameters, and then when we're using input parameters in a constructor, then we can set the private field equal to the input parameter name by the same name. Same is true with underscore hit points. That's the private field that we're initializing the value to, and we're passing in hit points camel cased, as you can see here. Okay. Now, I've seen some people use underscores for input parameters, but again, I want to emphasize that I don't think that's a good idea, because that's not the way that they do it in the .NET Framework class library. I think this is the standard that I see most often. All right, so I think we've talked about everything. And so now let's move on to talk about server control names. You've seen me use the convention, and let me see if I can pop open the default.aspx.cs, and we'll just look at it here in the HTML view. The ID is lowercase r in result, capital L in label, and the reason is because that server controls, new instances of server controls, are protected. In fact, to kind of demonstrate this, let's find the result label. I'm going to select it, right click on it, and say go to definition. This will open up the default.aspx.designer.cs file, this file that we've been ignoring. And what this does is just create C# that's based on the actions that we take inside of the ASPX pages. So in this case, it's creating a new instance of the label class called lowercase r result, capital L label, and you can see that this is protected, that we learned about in previous lesson. And so protected is only seen by inside of the class instance itself, as well as anything that derives from that class, and therefore it's kind of a variation on private, and therefore that's why we use the lowercase r, or rather the camel casing, for the names of controls. So here are all what I would consider to be proper control names. Camel cased, first name text box, Fall Out Boy radio button versus Panic at the Disco radio button, all right? OK button. So in all these cases, notice that I not only am using the casing to indicate what visibility that particular control has within our software, but also I'm using the word text box, radio button, button, and so on. So I'm using the name of the control to, again, let me know what this instance variable, or this identifier, is used for. It represents the first name text box, or in this case the result label that I want to reference throughout the rest of my application. Okay, now let's talk about some older naming conventions that have been used in the past but are no longer in vogue. In particular, we'll talk about Hungarian notation. It was popular through the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, but I think everybody's kind of moved on past that, or at least within the .NET developer community they have. And so you might see things like this: lowercase I counter, lowercase str first name, lowercase btn OK, that would be like a button control, capital C person, class, capital C person, and since it's a public class, capital C. All right. So the prefix indicated the type or the usage. I counter would be a integer counter used for maybe for loops or things of that nature. The str would represent a string. The btn would be a button control. Capital C would be a class, and so on. And the reason why this has kind of fallen out of vogue in recent years is because, first of all, it's hard to read. Those aren't English words. They're made-up constructs that represent something in the system, and they don't really flow off the tongue. They're easily forgotten whenever you're working in a different part of the system, and there's just, I think, a bunch of different reasons why they're just inconvenient and they're not expressive. And there used to be a time when memory was a concern, and so whenever people were writing code, they tried to keep their identifiers, their variable names, whatever the case might be, as small as possible because they only had so much RAM to work with. That's not really a concern anymore, and even so, as we learned previously, all of our code gets compiled down to intermediate language, at which point things are obfuscated anyway. But the other reason is because modern interactive development environments like Visual Studio will give you clues. If you just hover your mouse cursor, for example, over the damage inflicted on monster, it will tell you that, first of all, it's a locally scoped variable and that it's of type int. So I don't really need to go and name this I damage inflicted on monster because the I would be redundant. I can just see that by hovering my mouse cursor over that, and it will give me a bunch of different information. Or, for example, battle, capital B. Oh, it tells me that it's a class and it's defined in a certain namespace, CS-_ASP_044, and so on. All right, so since we have improvements in the IDEs that are available to us to write code, don't really need to use notation to indicate things about like type and visibility so much anymore. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about coding conventions, or at least naming conventions. There are a bunch of different coding conventions, and we'll continue to learn about those throughout the remainder of this series. So from now on, whenever you're writing code, make sure you follow these conventions. This is where a cheat sheet can come in handy whenever you're first getting started to make sure you're naming things correctly. But again, just learn the difference between Pascal case and camel case. And in general, everything that's public in nature should be Pascal cased. Everything that's private in nature should be camel case, with the exception of private fields, which should be prefixed by an underscore, okay, to prevent naming collisions between those and input parameters. All right, so I think that'll pretty much do it. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.